Would humanity still exist if humans were entirely rational and could voluntarily choose whether to get children or not? That's the question which we will discuss today. Before we get into this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Let's get into it. So, I've been reading, well, first of all, we're in a different scene today. I'm on my balcony and there's a little bit of wind, so I hope it's not too loud for the audio when you're listening to this. So we're going to go for it anyway, so let's go. I've been reading Schopenhauer's essays recently, specifically on the suffering of the world. And he takes a very sort of nihilistic, certainly not an optimistic view on human nature and the suffering, the inherent suffering that humans are subjected to in life. And there's one specific section which really caught my attention. He says, if the act, this is a quote now, if the act of procreation were neither the outcome of a desire nor accompanied by the feelings of pleasure, but a matter to be decided on the basis of purely rational considerations, is it likely the human race would still exist? ? Would each of us not have felt so much pity for the coming generation as to prefer to spare it the burden of existence, or at least not to wish to take it upon itself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? So what he's saying here is, if humans could separate any pleasures, any sort of instincts, and could rationally, consciously, voluntarily choose whether to get children or not, would the human race still exist? Because we are subjected to so much suffering that it's actually you wouldn't want that for your children or anybody else, so you wouldn't have kids then. And he goes on to say, for the world is hell, and men are on the one hand the tormented souls, and on the other hand the devils in it. Very interesting. So what he's saying is that the suffering is partially an inherent part of life. That is why humans are just tormented by it, but they are also the creators, the perpetrators of evil and suffering. And of course this draws a very negative picture of life itself, which I have made many videos before, several videos on the suffering of life before, and I do understand Schopenhauer's perspective here. But it is a good question as to whether humans would still get children. And what sprung to my mind when I was reading this is what God says to Eve in the book of in Genesis, in the Bible. After God figures out that they ate the forbidden fruit, he tells Eve then, quote, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And I think what this partially means is that he is telling Eve that you will bear the responsibility of bringing children into this world of suffering. Not only will you suffer physically when you conceive a child, but also when what you're doing is you are bringing a child, you are responsibly bringing a child into this world of suffering, and that is quite, I don't want to call it a punishment, but it's no jokes to say something like that. And I mean, people might say, well, is this some sexist, sexist treatment of God towards Eve? And it is not, because he punishes Adam. Similarly, he says, quote, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. And what I think he is telling Adam here is, you will have to work for the rest of your life in this tough environment, and that is your punishment, because that is a very... It will bring suffering to you in the same way, or not the same way, but of a potentially an adequate degree as Eve will have to bear. Now, I think Schopenhauer's perspective certainly has validity. Clearly you see a fair amount of people who have kids, actually, and haven't sort of conceived kids based on rational considerations. And life is, if we sort of backpedal a little bit, life is seriously tough and painful. Hence, you would need to configure humans in a way that they would need a deep, irrational instinct to overcome the rational conclusion that life is painful. So they would, if you look around once you're an adult or you're an adolescent, let's say, life is bloody tough, or you may not know it consciously, but unconsciously, let's say. And you think, well, I wouldn't want to bring any child into this world, and humans would need to be configured, or they would need to be primed in a way that some sort of instinct would overpower this horrific rational conclusion. That the instinct to have sex would be so strong that it overpowers the realization that life is suffering, let's say. And what I wanted to say before is, you see people who get kids and think, why have you got kids? It's not. You can see they don't get kids based on rational thought processes. Perhaps the parents still behave like kids themselves, and you think, why are you getting kids? Or they have no time for the kids. Also, if you're going to have kids, you might as well have the intention to raise them and invest time in them. But that doesn't seem to be obvious nowadays. So a fair amount of people just get kids because that is what everybody else around them is doing. It's what they've been taught, and there is by no means rationality behind conceiving children. By no means, Hence, we can agree that irrationality, pleasure, and other forms of influences determine the fact that humans get kids. So Schopenhauer's perspective is right that let's say pleasures and instincts drive reproduction. Yeah. So the choice of getting kids is not based on rational decisions. All right, then let's play with the thought. Would humans get kids if it was completely up to their rational decision making? I don't know. I literally don't know. I cannot say, because it is a very complex question. We would need to make several assumptions. Let's say you might think that, well, if kids are conceived irrationally and sort of involuntarily, then their parents wouldn't care about them once they are born and they're growing up. But that's not the case. I would say I'm optimistic here in that I think parents do care on average about their kids and do want to nurture them and do nurture them. But this is also backed by irrationality, desires, and instead of rationality. I would say that a lot of parents nurture their kids because their desires and instincts guide them to do so, not rationality. For example, parents want their kids to grow because the kid's success is an extension of the parents' success. So parents want to brag to others about their children's maturity and their academic skills because it reflects their own value, which is not, I wouldn't really consider that rationality, let's say. And when I was writing the ideas for this video, I realized that it's an extremely complex question whether humans would still get kids if they could choose rationally, and I didn't realize it would be so complex when starting. So if I were able to make a tentative simplification, I would say humans could still want to have kids, but it would depend on the circumstance of the parents. So if the parents have no meaning in their life, then they have no means to justify and voluntarily accept the painful inherency of life. They would have no positive outlook for their own children because all they know is suffering themselves. So they would think, okay, why would I bring my own child and have to also nurture and raise this child in this environment, in this game of suffering? But if the parents have meaning in their life, then they might want to have kids because with their meaning, their life is a positive sum game, and the meaning outweighs the suffering, and life actually becomes a game that they enjoy and voluntarily want to play. So they think, okay, this thing called life is valuable and meaningful, and I would want to show this game to my own children because it's worth playing. It's worth to be alive. And this variable of whether there is meaning in someone's life or not is dependent on what they have been taught, I would say, and their environment. Whether meaning is present depends on several variables, which are difficult to pinpoint and predict. One cannot easily predict or say a child will grow up to have a meaningful life because they went to a private school or they had a healthy relationship to their parents. I think I think it is quite individual and quite idiosyncratic whether somebody finds meaning or not in their life. Yeah, so it really boils down to the factors determining the discovery of meaning, I would say. And that is, I think it happens on an idiosyncratic level, but it is nurtured on an aggregate, maybe even a societal level, because if there is like a cultural notion of how to find meaning or how to teach how to find meaning, so it is taught in school, in the educational system, then naturally children would have a proclivity to actually seek out meaning actively instead of seek out other things like short-term pleasures or status, economic status, like goals, objectives like that. But if the teaching of meaning and fulfillment is absent, and also if they are taught nihilistic tendencies, then you will have I think you can estimate, you can have an aggregate average level of suffering that is higher than if the children had been taught how to find meaning. Yeah. So in conclusion, if we ask the question, would humanity still exist if humans could rationally and voluntarily choose to have children, so the reproduction would not be based on instinctual sexual pleasure and desires? I mean, you would need to run a seriously complex simulation to figure that out, and we can't really accurately predict it. But one could say that it really boils down to whether humans find a justification for their suffering and find a value in their life that is of a greater magnitude than their suffering. So in the end, their life is a positive sum game, and the people then would actually want to have kids themselves, and would think, okay, this thing called life is actually fun. It makes my soul. It makes my soul vibrate in a way that is meaningful and purposeful and actually worth it, let's say. And if you have that, then I think humans would have the proclivity to have children. But if that is absent, so the aggregate level of suffering is higher, then I wouldn't necessarily say so. Yeah. But wait, yeah. But I mean, the suffering is a different variable from meaning then, because you can have a totalitarian regime where people suffer more, which is like separated from the meaning. Yes, so we'll need to break that down, but I've already done that in other videos, and you can look on my playlist on the suffering dynamics, I think. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Thank you for listening.